Have you ever played an RPG where the beginning sucks so hard that you drop it after 2 hours and don't pick it up for half a decade before getting back to it, and then actually finishing it and having fun with it? That's what happened with me when I played Dark Cloud, and that's why I wanted to analyze why the first dungeon of that game sucks so hard. For context, Dark Cloud is a JRPG published by Sony in the early days of the PlayStation 2. It was the first game by the studio Level 5, and while the title wasn't very successful in Japan, it was quite popular in the West, so much so that it spawned a sequel, and the developer keeps making games to this day. First, I'll talk in detail about the upgrade system, as it is one of the most remarkable mechanics in the game, and coincidentally, what makes the Divine Beast Cave such a miserable experience. Each weapon is customizable with attachments. Whenever you kill an enemy, the weapon gains abs. Once the abs bar is filled completely, you get an option to upgrade a weapon, which gives a flat 1 increase in all basic stats, as well as absorbing attachments equipped on it to gain stats and abilities. After a weapon has been upgraded at least 5 times, you get an option to turn it into a synth sphere, which destroys the weapon in the process, but it turns it into a special type of attachment that carries all of the abilities of its predecessor, as well as 60% of the original weapon stats. The synth spheres can be used on any weapon, regardless of what type of weapon they originated from, giving a huge boost in its statistics, as well as giving you abilities. Once the statistics have grown enough in the right places, a weapon can be built up into a new weapon, which will usually have higher maximum stats and possibly new abilities. One more important thing is that weapons have durability. If it runs out, the weapon is gone forever. Thankfully, repairing is done using a cheap consumable item that can be bought at literally every store in the game. So, for the most part, it's not an issue. What makes this system great is the freedom you get in building your weapons, and its relative simplicity. It's not locked behind any specific ingredients. Unlocking an upgrade shop or buying an official strategy guide, let's be honest, that's kind of how it was back in the day. The game also has a certain exploit which allows you to kill an enemy with your strong weapon while letting the abs flow to another one. The exploit hilariously stems from a mechanic that was implemented to prevent you from farming double ABS points from skeletons, which can revive once their HP is gone. Essentially what happens is that the game waits for the model to vanish completely before cashing out the ABS, which, in turn, gives you ample window to swap to another weapon. While this is obviously an exploit, it plays so well into the game loop, it actually makes it feel like a secret mechanic. The way I abused it is I would kill everything with my main weapon and then distribute the ABS to weapons I was never going to use. And then only upgrade my main weapon once I have developed a synth sphere and or got some gems to maximize each upgrade of my main weapon. Upgrading without gems or synth spheres is honestly a waste of your time and effort, as the flat 1+ increase in basic statistics just doesn't make enough of an impact, and regular attachments don't make enough of a splash, and apps cost only increase per each upgrade level very, very quickly. In short, funneling all the ABS into a bad weapon makes it easier to make a much more powerful low upgrade level enhancements to your main weapon, and it also makes it very easy to catch up your other party members once they join you along for the adventure. The Divine Beast Cave is the first dungeon Toa needs to conquer on his journey. All dungeons in the game share same basic mechanics. Each floor has a number of atla, which are elements of houses as well as people that you need to collect in order to progress through the chapter. And they're mostly randomized, so each time you play through the game you unlock the houses and facilities in different order. Until a certain facility is completely finished, it cannot be used. even if the building and the person bound to it are already assigned to it. In order to progress to the next floor, you need to find the key by defeating a random enemy. Any enemy on each floor can have the key, then there is no way to tell which one. While the weapon system in Dark Cloud is excellent, the same can be said for its combat. You only have one button, which isn't a problem in itself. You can hold that button in order to perform a stronger hit, or press it repeatedly for a combo. You also have a guard, but there is no way for you to dodge. As for the combo, it's not very reliable, especially when it comes to Toan, as subsequent hits tend to miss the enemy inexplicably or hit them while they have invincibility frames. So oftentimes you'll find yourself stab and running. Also, if you happen to hit a guarding enemy, your durability takes a much harder hit than when hitting them normally. Simplistic combat is not a huge issue in the scale of the whole game, thanks to the other characters that join you. You can switch between them as you see fit, and they give you a much needed coverage for various enemy types. But at the start of the game, you're alone, and not every enemy is so easy to handle at the melee range. Couple that with the fact that only a few floors in, the game introduces rock enemies, who have several special traits, such as being incredibly strong, as they can kill you in give or take 1.5 hits, and having loads of HP, as well as draining the durability of your weapon way faster, even without guarding, and even harder when guarding. Before you enter the first dungeon, you get an unbreakable, between quotes, dagger, which is very weak, and if it breaks, it becomes even weaker and loses all of the upgrades you poured into it. It doesn't disappear though, and it can be restored to its base form using a repair powder. Unlike normal weapons, it can't be built up into any other weapon, so any attachment you put into it are literally wasted, because you also cannot status break it into a synth sphere. What goes onto an unbreakable dagger stays on the unbreakable dagger until it breaks. So yeah, it's kinda bad. The worst part is, the game tells you absolutely nothing about this little detail, so you may waste a lot of time and effort trying to make a strong unbreakable weapon for yourself, which just isn't possible within the constraints of this game. The unbreakable dagger is obviously meant as a last resort weapon or some kind of training wheels. Something you can fall back on if you happen to break your good sword. It's a common feature in games that feature deteriorating equipment, but in nearly all cases it ends up being a waste of inventory space shortly after the start of the game, once you find a good weapon. However, depending on your luck, you may need to rely on this pitiful butter knife throughout most of the first dungeon, as none of the villagers will actually give you a weapon in exchange for fixing their houses, which is actually very common in all the other chapters. You also can't buy any weapons in the first town, but you can in most of the other ones. And the only way you can actually get your hands on a weapon is just getting lucky with a big chest, which is not even a guarantee that you're gonna find a big chest, or a big chest containing a weapon, or a big chest that isn't a goddamn mimic. Normally you'd think, yeah mate, I'm gonna just stuff my inventory full of potions, repair powders and such, but sadly that's not an option. At least it wasn't for me with my poor luck. The shop that sells those things is one of the facilities you need to rebuild, and it's completely random as to when you actually get to accomplish that. Until that happens, all you can rely on is the mayor, who will only fill up to one of each basic consumables, which is antidote, bread, water, and repair powder. If you happen to have picked up some along the way throughout the dungeon, the prick won't give you an extra. And let me tell you, even going through a dungeon with a fully fixed dagger and a spare repair powder is barely enough to pass a floor, especially after the rock enemies get introduced. Let's not even get into the fact that you can get poisoned more than once per floor, or just simply not yet have a grasp on combat, which, you know, it happens, especially when you start playing the game for the first time in the first dungeon, and you know, it really kinda sucks that there is no cushion for that. And the cherry on top of it all is that at about halfway point through the dungeon, you're introduced to your first companion, who also starts off with a very bad unbreakable weapon. Hers is somehow even worse, doing ones of damage to enemies on average. You can't, however, ignore her, because in only a couple of floors, she's going to be forced to beat an entire floor on her own. Pro tip, stock up on bombs and other attack items for this floor and just go to town. There is absolutely no use for them other than those specific kinds of floors. All this combined snowballs into an utterly miserable experience. It encourages a completely different playstyle compared to how the whole rest of the game is played. In order to beat the Divine Beast Cave, you have to approach it like a hardcore game of survival, where the resources are limited and you cannot afford to fight every enemy, and while you don't need to kill every enemy on each floor, the key to progress is randomly assigned to any of them, and any monster can have them. So you need to get strategically lucky when picking out enemies that may or may not have the item that you need to progress, and only fight those. I mean, you can do that, just get lucky. In all subsequent dungeons, you still need to pay attention to your durability, but you're never in a position where you can't afford to spare a repair powder, or any other consumables for that matter. At worst, you may forget to buy some and you may need to leave the dungeon, or swap to any of the other characters who should be perfectly capable if they still have durability and HP, or quench. I believe this reverse difficulty curve is part of the reason why this game wasn't very popular in Japan, but it actually struck a chord with Western gamers. Western RPGs from the 90s and early 2000s had a tendency to be front-loaded on difficulty and becoming babies easy by the time you reach the end. May have been intentional, or may have just been poor design. Either way, it was just the norm at the time. How to improve this? There is actually very little that keeps the Divine Beast Cave from being a perfectly okay introduction to this wonderful game. First things first, the player should 100% get a normal weapon after clearing the first 3 floors of the dungeon. The less time and effort you spend on the emergency dagger, the better, as anything you put into it is a literal waste of time and effort. Second thing, fix the RNG so that within the first few floors, the shop parts will spawn in the dungeon. You absolutely need that shop in order to function correctly in this game. Alternatively, you can make the mayor more generous. Have him top you up to 3 of each consumable item, as that is much more comfortable number to explore with. And my last point is, have the unbreakable dagger lose its unbreakability once you clear the Divine Beast Cave, and have it become a regular weapon. This mechanic actually already exists within the game and applies to a certain sword you get in the second chapter. That way, your training wheels can be technically removed, and you can get some use out of the weapon. You could either turn it into a synth sphere, or have it turn into your final weapon that you'll be using for the rest of the game. Just do whatever you want with it. So here's my 2 bits on the design of this horrid dungeon, why it scared me off when I first played the game, and possibly many other people, and some of my ideas on how to combat this. Thankfully, unlike some other PS2 RPGs, the snowball of bad game design melts by the time it gets to the second chapter of the game, unlike, say, Persona 3, where it starts forming about 4 hours in after you're done with the first cutscene and becomes a Kusoga avalanche by the end, 70 hours in of suffering. But in any case, thank you very much for watching, and have a nice evening, day, or whatever time it is. Bye.